This week's video is going to focus on the Atlantic slave trade. We will be looking very specifically at the slave trade itself, as well as the Middle Passage and the impact that the slave trade had on those who were involved. In the coming weeks, we're also going to look more specifically at the cultures that emerge in the Americas because of the Africans that are forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas, as well as the impact that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa itself. But to start, we're going to look more specifically at the Atlantic slave trade to sort of get background knowledge and to better understand what this trade looks like. For this week, you will have a secondary source reading, and this PowerPoint will also be very important. One thing I would like for you to keep in mind is that with all of these PowerPoints, if you go down to the bottom, you will see that there is this notes section, and if you click on that, it will bring up whatever notes are available. The first African slaves are going to be brought to the New World in 1502. So if you think about Christopher Columbus in 1492 coming to the Americas, the first slaves will be brought in within 10 years. Initially, you're going to also start to see a lot of native labor from Native Americans that are used as slaves. However, we are going to see that it will eventually shift to African slaves. However, most of these initial slaves are actually going to be coming from Spain. So they're not coming directly from Africa. And they have many different jobs that they're going to be doing. So it's not initially this plantation system and this plantation labor that you so often hear about. And the next question that a lot of times I'll hear in classes is, why didn't they just enslave Native Americans? And in one sense, they do. In a lot of the Spanish colonies, as well as with the Portuguese, and in some cases even the English, you're going to see the natives being forced to labor for Europeans. However, very quickly, the native populations are going to start dying from diseases. Things like smallpox, measles, things that Europeans had built up some immunity to, or they weren't as affected by. These natives have never seen these diseases before, and because of this, they are going to die in record numbers. In some areas, up to 90% of the native population can be killed by one disease. And because of this, it's not going to be seen as a very viable labor source. In addition to that, if you think about Native Americans, they could very easily blend in with the environment. If they are to be enslaved or to be forced to work for Europeans, they can sort of pick up and they can run away and they can blend in a little better with their surroundings. And they also know their surroundings a lot better than other groups might. In addition to that, you'll see in the PowerPoint, one thing that I have put on here is going to have to deal with Las Casas. And with Las Casas, what we're thinking about is Bartholomew de Las Casas. He actually comes to the New World and he sees what's happening to these Native Americans firsthand. And he eventually ends up pleading for change. He says that what's happening to the natives isn't right, and he doesn't want to see these native peoples being abused any further. And when we talk about this type of abuse, it's very, very severe. There are instances where people are attacked with dogs. There are instances where people have their feet burned. People are killed. People are mauled. Very, very bad situation. And because of this, and because of what Las Casas has to say, by around 1542, you're going to have the new laws passed in Spain. And these laws, part of what they say is that the enslavement of Native Americans is actually going to be illegal. And now they're likely still used, but they're going to have to find a different and more sustainable labor force. And Las Casas, even though he had a lot of great things he was able to do to help save native populations, that did not include African slaves, and he, as well as many others, believed that African slaves could potentially be a better solution. And that brings up the question of why enslave Africans. And there's a couple of reasons that I have listed for you right here. The first is that they argue that they are going to be stronger. So they say that Africans, as far as workers, they're stronger. And in addition to that, they know a lot more about certain types of crops, things like rice. As we'll see when you get to South Carolina, there are going to be a lot of enslaved people who work to cultivate rice, and they have that knowledge. They're the ones who bring that knowledge with them. And because of that, they become a more viable labor force. In addition to that, they can't run away to their homes as easily. There's an ocean separating them from them and their homes, whereas Native Americans, again, they know the lay of the land, and it would be much easier for them to be able to escape and to also have people nearby who might help them to escape. And finally, another reason why they switched to using African slave labor, a lot of the times people justified it, whether it was a real reason for the switch or not, by saying that since they are not Christian, they could be given civilization. This is, of course, a little bit of a flawed logic because many of the people who bring African slaves over to work on plantations or to work in mines or whatever the work might potentially be, they're not doing it for their benefit. They're not doing it so they can bring them Christianity or, again, civilization. They're doing it for the labor force. In addition to that, you have to understand that many African people already have their own religion, and in some parts of Africa, you do see Christianity as a predominant religion. Islam is also practiced very heavily in certain parts of Africa, and in addition to that, they say they don't have civilization, but a lot of places in Africa have their own governments, and they have their own understanding of the world, no different than Europeans. So by 1518, they are importing from Africa. It's also important to remember the Asiento, and this is actually a contract from Spain that is basically going to give a monopoly to particular countries or individual companies in order to bring African slaves to the Americas, and it is going to make countries very, very wealthy. So different nations like France and England, they're going to hold it at various times, but the Asiento is going to help to make different countries very wealthy by being able to bring slaves to the Americas. So most commonly, when you think about slavery, you think about plantation slavery, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that in North America, the plantation system and the idea of a plantation system had existed for a very long time. By the time you start to see the English importing slaves and creating different types of plantations, and because of that, they start using it very early. But it's important to remember that the plantation system and the sort of complex that emerges around it did not exist when Europeans first started coming to the New World, but rather it's something that developed over time. And to best understand that, I think it's really important to look at Brazil. A great example of the emergence of a plantation complex. When the Portuguese first start looking at Brazil, they have to first question the Treaty of Tordesillas, which we learned about last week. And if you remember, that line roughly divides up the New World. So thinking about Africa, but also the Americas. And basically what it says is that the Portuguese are going to have control over the ports that they have on the west coast of Africa. And the Spanish are going to have control over the areas that they are settling in the New World. And because of that, Brazil brings up a big question because technically a sliver of Brazil is going to fall within the realm of the Portuguese. And the Spanish really don't push back too far on the Portuguese having Brazil as one of their colonies. And because of that, the Portuguese will monopolize on this. The first thing they do when they get to Brazil is they actually begin using native labor to extract dyewoods. These dyewoods are used for many different things, but it's not that profitable. It does make money for a select few individuals, but it's not something that's enticing enough to get people to leave Portugal and come to Brazil. In addition to that, very few people even settle. However, sugar is becoming increasingly popular in Europe. People are learning how to use sugar a little bit more heavily, and they really enjoy having sugar as part of their diets. So because of this, in the 1530s and 40s, the people who were settling in Brazil actually began to experiment with sugar. They use native labor, but again, this isn't a very reliable source. A lot of people are going to be dying from the contact that they have with Europeans. They can run away, whatever the various reasons are. Another question that comes into play is why not use Europeans to labor on sugar plantations? For places like Spain and Portugal, it's very hard to entice Europeans to come to the New World to work. We'll see a different story when we start to look at places like Jamestown, even slightly in New England and the Carolinas, as far as the English. But for people who are living in Spain and Portugal, even places like France, life might not be great in Europe, but it's definitely better from what they've heard about the colonies. They hear about these colonies and they learn about the fact that there are a lot of diseases. They learn about the fact that it's very hot, very sweaty, lots of mosquitoes. And the life expectancy for people who labor in these types of environments is actually very, very low. So even though life might not be perfect in Europe, it's definitely in their eyes better than going to the New World, especially somewhere like Brazil. In the 1570s and 1580s, the Portuguese start to bring African laborers to Brazil. So they are going to start to cultivate part of that plantation complex, but it's not really going to be until the 1620s and 1640s when the Dutch rebel against the Spanish. Okay, so again, the Dutch are going to be rebelling against Spain. And because of that, they actually end up trying to affect the Portuguese. The Portuguese and the Spanish have a very clear alliance at this point. And they're going to do that by attacking Brazil. Again, it's not very heavily settled. And they're going to end up taking control of Brazil. When they take control of Brazil, they bring with them the knowledge of sugar. They bring even more slaves, and the Dutch, more than anyone else, are well known for transportation. They have huge ships, and they are able to use these ships in order to transport goods from the New World to Europe and vice versa. So basically what's going to happen is they are going to use Brazil to create this plantation complex. And when we talk about a plantation system or this plantation complex that emerges, I want to sort of break down what this means. First of all, in order to have a plantation system, you have to have a cash crop. Now, a cash crop is different from a crop for personal consumption or for the consumption of just a family. Think about a cash crop. You're thinking about goods like sugar, tobacco, even if you think about rice. Now, if you are to take sugar or tobacco, those are two really good examples, and you grow hundreds and hundreds of acres of these crops, you are going to have a lot of that one commodity. However, you can't take tobacco or sugar and live solely on those products. You can't just consume sugar. You can't just consume tobacco. So what you have to do is take it and you have to sell that product. And that's why it's considered a cash crop. You're going to be selling large quantities of the product, and you're going to use that money to buy the other goods that you might need. In addition to that, part of the plantation system is going to be having a labor force. And with that, again, African labor is what we are going to usually see when these plantation systems emerge. With the labor force, it has to be something that is going to be feasible as far as cost. As terrible as that sounds, we have to remember that these people really do see the slave trade and see African slaves as a commodity, no different than the way they see commodities like sugar. So they have to have a labor force. And lastly, you have to have transportation to get the goods from one place to another. So as you can see on this PowerPoint over here, you're going to be able to see that within Brazil, they have the crop, that crop being sugar. They have the labor force coming from Africa. And then they are also going to have transportation from the Dutch, which is going to get their goods back to Europe where they can make a profit. Now, of course, eventually the Dutch will be kicked out of Brazil. The Portuguese take control again. However, even once the Portuguese take control, the Dutch do still do most of the shipping for the Portuguese. So Barbados is going to be another area where you are going to see this plantation system emerge. So it's actually going to be settled by the British in 1627. However, very similarly to Brazil, the British don't really know what to do with Barbados. One thing they do is they bring a lot of pigs with them to Barbados. But even when they bring those pigs, they don't really use them as a way of creating a profit. And eventually the island becomes completely overrun with these pigs. However, the Dutch will also bring them what becomes known as slavery in a box. Basically, they bring them a plantation system. And what they're going to do, as far as the British Caribbean and Barbados in particular, is they bring the knowledge of sugar and slaves as well as a mode of transportation. And because of this, by the 1660s, again, think about that, that's within 30 something years, you're going to see that Barbados will, first of all, become almost entirely black, meaning that there are more slaves than there are settlers, and not just more than 50%. You're thinking about almost entirely made up of enslaved people, and you're also going to see that it becomes a jewel for the British. So often we think about the North American colonies, we think about Jamestown, or we think about, the Carolinas. However, the real money maker for the British, it's going to be in the Caribbean, thinking about places like Barbados. These places are going to cause the British to become very, very wealthy. So again, I just want you to think a little bit about what that means, and again, the idea of the plantation complex and how it can take hold. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be the idea of slavery in Africa. Now, slavery in Africa is very different from what slaves are going to encounter in the Americas, and I think it's important to understand what it really looked like. There are so many misconceptions of not only what slavery in Africa was like, but just what Africa was like in general and what Africa is still like. There are many misconceptions. So first of all, with slavery in Africa, most of those who are enslaved are actually going to come as a result of war or expansion campaigns. So one group of people expanding onto another group's land. If a war does ensue, then you're going to see captives. In addition to that, slaves in Africa work in many different sectors of the economy. They don't just work as far as plantations or creating an agricultural good. They can work with metal, they can work with lumber, they can work as servants, whatever it is. There are many different occupations that they have. You see a lot of them working as artisans, making different types of craft goods, but of course there are still some involved with agriculture. Oftentimes, slaves are not slaves for life in Africa. Eventually, they become absorbed into the existing society. So they'll be absorbed by the people who are going to actually enslave them. In many cases, they also have property rights, but it is very different from slavery in the Americas. Now, another thing that I want to point out is that slavery in Africa, there's no way for Europeans to really come in and dominate the market without Africans as well. And it's really important that we start to break this down. So with Europeans, they're not going to be able to go into Africa and do what some people refer to as hit and runs. It's not like these Europeans are running in and they're going and they're attacking these Africans and they're going to take them captive and take them back to the ships. That's not feasible. In many ways, Europeans who try to go into the interior of Africa in order to obtain slaves, number one, they could be killed very quickly by Africans themselves. They stick out like a sore thumb and they know what they're there for. So they're going to be killed that way. If they are able to successfully obtain a couple of slaves and make it back to the coast, a lot of them are actually going to end up getting very sick. There are a lot of diseases within Africa, things like malaria, that Europeans don't really have any built up immunity for. Yellow fever is another example, and they're going to end up getting very sick, and it's very unlikely that they would survive. So that's not going to be feasible. Rather, you have to think about the fact that they work with Africans. But I want to make sure that we are very clear that this is not Africans selling Africans. You see that very commonly portrayed on television programs, or you'll hear other people talk about, oh, well, it was Africans selling Africans to Europeans. That is very overly simplified. If you think about Africa, that is a continent. It's not a country, it's not a city, it's not a group of people. That's like referring to Europe as just Europe when you're trying to talk about the English or trying to talk about the Spanish. It's very, very broad as far as a term. So rather than thinking about it as Africans selling Africans, think about it instead as individual kingdoms selling outsiders or people from other kingdoms. So if you think about it in that way, hopefully that will help just a little. So next, I want us to think a little bit about how Africans came to be part of this Atlantic slave trade, because while it is true that slavery did exist in Africa before Europeans arrived, it was definitely amplified once Europeans did arrive, and there are several reasons for that. First of all, a lot of people have commonly believed that Europeans began selling guns to Africans, which led to more wars. And while it is true that Europeans did sell Africans guns or traded them for slaves, more recent historians have found that many of the wars that developed were over more internal causes, not directly related to the slave trade. Some of these causes, of course, have to do with land and expanding this land. This is similar to what you see in other parts of the world. If you think about Europe, in different parts of world history, you have seen different groups. Think about even the French and the Germans expanding onto different parts of each other's land, or what they perceive as their land, and different wars and battles sort of ensuing because of that land. Same sort of idea, same situation. But war is absolutely a way that you can get captives. Another is that a lot of people were tricked into slavery. There are many stories of men and women being invited into people's homes, given drinks, and they later find themselves enslaved. There's one account that I like to bring up of a pregnant woman who was actually kidnapped on her way home because they knew she would go for a high price, because in a sick way, people believed it would be like getting two for the price of one. So getting two slaves and only paying for one. In addition to that, the third way that people could be enslaved would be through trials. So slavery was a typical punishment for breaking the law and not being able to pay your debts back. So for example, if you were to steal something, even if it was something small, and you were to be taken before a trial of people, if they find you guilty, which a lot of times they would, there's a really good chance that you could end up actually being enslaved instead of other options. Okay? So think about it that way as well. The picture that I have above is actually going to show Africans as they are being marched to the coast. And this is something that I hope you pick up on with your primary source reading from Equiano. He talks about his march to the coast and how he comes to be on the west coast of Africa. But as you can see, these people are going to be bound around their neck, and they're going to be bound to one another, and they are forced to walk for many, many miles each day. At this point, they may or may not know some of the people who are with them. There is a chance that they do. However, this might not be true for all people, and they might be in a group where they don't know anyone. The next step for many African slaves is going to come when they actually get to the West African coast. Now, on this coast, they're going to stay in what becomes known as castles. One of the biggest examples is going to be Elmina Castle. Basically, these are holding cells where they're going to hold these African slaves until Europeans are able to come, and the Europeans will sort of purchase the slaves from there. They could be held for many months. The amount of time that they are held in these castles varies from slave to slave, and if it's not a prime time, if they're not purchasing a lot of slaves at that point, you could sit in these dark, cramped, very, very hot, sweaty rooms with very little ventilation, with no real way to use the bathroom for months on end. There are a lot of Africans who are believed to have gotten very, very sick in this particular phase of their journey. And a lot of them, even if they don't die while they're in these castles, they will die on the Atlantic slave trade. So as they're actually going to the New World, they die on the slave ships. And many people believe one big cause is because of the malnourishment that they experience here. However, with even all of that malnourishment, we have to keep in mind that a lot of times these slaves are going to be fed well, and they are forced to exercise. They want them to look good for these Europeans. They see this as a commodity no different than if they were selling livestock or selling animals. And that is absolutely a terrible thing for us to think about, but it is true, and it's important for us to understand the mindset that they had. They definitely thought of these people as a commodity. So the next thing I want us to think about, and you more especially, is going to be what was life like on the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is after the slaves have been inspected and they are going to be taken to a slave ship. So I want you to think about what Equiano is going to talk about. Remember, more than 12 million people are going to be transported to the New World from Africa, and this is going to be forced transportation. Of this, you're going to see another 4 million slaves are likely going to be killed while they're on board slave ships. Think about those numbers. 4 million are going to be killed or are going to perish. That means that 16 million were likely taken from Africa. With the Middle Passage, keep in mind it's very nasty. There's often only one bucket below, sometimes two, depending on how big the slave ship actually is. And with these buckets, that's where they use the bathroom. But you're going to be chained to other people. So what if you can't get up and actually make it to the bathroom? There are a lot of instances where slaves probably had to use the bathroom because they couldn't get other people to get up so they could get to a bucket. You also have to think about what they're laying on. They're laying on wood, the bottom of a ship. And when the ship rocks, if you've ever been on a ship, when it rocks, their bodies are going to be laid down for the most part, some of them sitting, but most of them laid down. And this is going to rock up against their skin and creates a lot of cuts and sores. When they go to clean these lower decks where the slaves are held, they're actually going to use salt water from the ocean. So imagine having those cuts, but then also having that salt water that could potentially get in them as well. Not just the nasty conditions, you also have to think about the sadness that these slaves are feeling. So often it's easy to forget, but remember, these are people, and yes, they probably are experiencing extreme loss. For many of these people, they will never see their parents again. They will never see their siblings again. They will never see their spouse or their children, depending on who they are. And imagine losing everyone you've ever known and loved at one time and being so scared and so confused. Think about the sheer amount of sadness and grief that you would have to deal with, along with the enslavement that you are currently facing. So please keep that in mind as well. And think about what Equiano talks about. He talks a lot about his sister. Think about those moments as you read that source as well. As far as the slaves, they are often left below deck at night, but then during the day they will be allowed on deck. And when they're brought on deck, they want to make sure that they are able to get exercise or that they are going to dance. Part of this is going to be so they can get a workout, so that they'll be in better shape when they are going to these different parts of the New World. They also force slaves to eat. A lot of slaves refuse to eat. They're, again, very sad and depressed, and they're very upset with their situation. So a lot of them refuse to eat, but if they do refuse, they will be forced. There are also a lot of slaves who try to jump overboard. When they try to jump overboard, a lot of times they believe that they'll be able to get back to their families or get back to Africa. But others understood that it was a suicide mission, and they still preferred to have that death to their loss of autonomy and the loss of their family. So please keep all of this in mind as we go forward. And again, remember these ideas as you look at Equiano. The next thing I wanted to show you guys, just as we sort of wrap up this unit on the slave trade, is going to be this map, and this is going to show you where slaves are coming from and the areas that they are going to. So keep in mind that only around 3% of slaves are taken to North America, and I bring that back up because I really want you guys to understand while we talk about the slave trade before we talk about the North American colonies. If you look at this particular map with these arrows, think about the number of slaves that are brought to places like Brazil, to places like the Caribbean, and all of this is going to be important. It's going to shape not only American history, but also world history. So please just keep that in mind. But otherwise, that's going to sort of wrap it up for this video. I hope that you learned something new about the slave trade, and I will talk to you in the next video.